Hey everybody, welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe. And as always, I'm ready to dive into some seriously juicy info with you all today. It's like we're mixing up a knowledge cocktail here. Strong stuff, but oh, so smooth going down.
And I'm Sunny, your friendly neighborhood fact checker. I'll make sure we get all the ingredients right. Speaking of mixing things up, you know it's always a good blend? Travel whiskey and discovering awesome new things. You have to check out our friend Micky's YouTube channel, Mickytolife.
Yeah, Mickey's the best. He's always got something cool going on. Today, we're sorting through quite a stack of information, all really circling around recent moves with Trump's tariff policies.
That's right. And how those policies are, sending ripples through global trade and, frankly, some pretty tense geopolitical spots.
Yeah, the sources we've got are pretty wide-ranging. We're talking legal fights over the tariffs themselves.
All the way to things like who's showing up or not showing up at major security meetings, new tech restrictions.
And even getting down to, like, student visas and university funding, which is fascinating.
It really is.
So our goal here is to try and cut through some of that noise, pull out the key takeaways from these sources, and really understand what's going on right now.
And crucially, how these different pieces, which might seem separate, actually connect.
Okay, let's get into it. Where do we start? The tariffs themselves.
Yeah, let's kick off there. So the sources highlight this legal challenge pretty prominently. Basically, a federal appeals court stepped in, and they temporarily blocked a lower court's ruling. And that original ruling, it could have potentially overturned quite a few of the tariffs from the Trump administration.
Wow. Okay. So that immediately throws a lot of uncertainty into the mix, right?
Yeah.
Legally, but also for, like, markets.
Absolutely. The sources specifically pointed out the market reaction. It was kind of interesting, even the possibility, just the hint of temporary tariff relief actually saw stocks dip a bit.
Huh. So it shows how much these tariffs were sort of baked into expectations now, doesn't it?
It really does. And, the sources are pretty clear that this legal back and forth might not even be the final say on the policies.
How so?
Well, one source directly called Trump a loyal supporter of tariffs. And it suggested he's already thinking about other ways to keep them going, even if these particular court challenges ultimately fail.
Right. So the core commitment to tariffs seems pretty solid, regardless of the legal maneuvering.
That's the impression, yeah. And the sources were careful, interestingly, to frame this whole thing between the administration and the courts. They didn't call it interference.
Okay.
They described it more as this constitutional game, under the idea of separation of powers, basically saying legal challenges are a normal part of how this works.
Gotcha. That sets the stage.
Okay.
Okay, so taking that idea of persistent tariffs, how do the sources link that to the bigger picture, especially the rising tensions with China?
Well, a really striking example the sources brought up was the Shangri-La dialogue, that big security summit in Singapore, and the fact that China's defense minister just skipped it this year, first time since 2019, apparently. That was flagged as a pretty clear sign of, heightened tension.
And a missed chance for talks, presumably.
Definitely a missed opportunity for those high-level face-to-face chats. Meanwhile, the sources noted the U.S. was there in force. Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, gave a speech, strong delegation.
And their message. What were they saying, according to the sources?
The stated goals were about rebuilding deterrence with China and really working closely with allies in the region.
Okay, but wasn't there a wrinkle there? I seem to remember something in the sources about.
Yes. Good point. One source did add that layer of complexity, reminding us about Trump's past criticisms of allies, not spending enough on defense.
Right.
And the implication was, well, does that history maybe raise questions now about how reliable the U.S. commitment to those alliances really is long-term, even as they're trying to strengthen them?
That's a tension point within the alliances themselves, then.
Exactly. And tied right into this whole dynamic, the sources got into the U.S. imposing visa restrictions on certain Chinese students.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Specifically targeting those with alleged links to the CCP or students in fields the U.S. considers key areas. So it's moving beyond just diplomacy into things affecting people directly.
Okay, direct impacts. Let's follow that thread into trade talks and tech restrictions. What's the state of play there, based on what we read?
Well, the sources describe the U.S.-China trade talks as somewhat stalled right now.
Stalled. And there was that interesting bit about a Geneva agreement.
Yes. That was intriguing. Apparently there was a deal. China would resume exporting rare earths super important for tech in exchange for the U.S. allowing certain high-tech equipment exports to China. But the sources claim neither side has really followed through fully.
And that hasn't gone down well.
Apparently not. The sources indicated Trump was angered by this lack of follow-through on both sides.
So while talks are stalled, what's happening on the tech front? Are restrictions easing or?
Quite the opposite, actually. So sources really emphasized that the U.S. is expanding tech restrictions. They gave concrete examples.
Like what?
Like ordering companies, Synopsys was named specifically. They make crucial chip design software, ordering them to stop sales and services to China.
Wow.
And also revoking existing export licenses for other tech firms.
And the outlook isn't great if talks stay stalled, is it?
No. The sources suggested the expectation is definitely for these tech restrictions to get even tighter if there's no progress on the trade front.
And it's not just chips and software, right? There was something about cables.
Yeah, undersea cables. The sources mentioned the U.S. actively intervening to block projects that involve Chinese companies.
Oh, why? What were the concerns?
The reasons cited were pretty fundamental. Lack of trust, worries about control, potential for data monitoring, and, the risk of intellectual property theft through that critical infrastructure. It shows how deep this tech decoupling idea goes.
Okay. Shifting gears slightly, the sources also touched on some related U.S. domestic stuff. Monetary policy came up.
Just briefly. Mentioned a meeting between Fed Chair Jerome Powell and President Trump.
And the dynamic there. Still the same.
Pretty much. The sources describe Trump continuing to push for interest rate cuts and Powell sticking to the Fed's line. Decisions are based on data, politically neutral. That tension between the White House and the Fed seems ongoing.
Right. And then there's Elon Musk. Something about a government role.
Yeah, he had been serving as a special government employee for about 4 months with a team the sources called DOGE.
DOGE, okay. And he left.
He did. Reason given, according to the sources, was needing to focus on Tesla and SpaceX priorities. But he apparently said he's still willing to offer advice.
And what was that DOGE team even doing?
Focused on government efficiency, it seems. The sources said they'd identified something like $175 billion in potential cost savings.
Wow.
And had submitted a specific $9.4 billion plan to Congress. It was framed as part of the administration's push to cut costs.
Got it. Okay, let's pivot now, because the sources spent a lot of time on something that could have really long-term impacts. Education and the flow of talent globally.
Yes, this was a major theme, starting with proposed federal budget cuts under Trump that would hit research funding and student aid.
And that directly impacts universities.
Big time. The sources names Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Columbia as potentially facing funding pauses or cuts. And the perspective offered was that this kind of move actually weakens U.S. soft power.
Right, and the idea that maybe private money could just fill the gap.
The sources question that, suggesting private funding often looks for shorter-term returns, not necessarily the kind of basic long-term research that federal grants support.
Which is crucial because these universities aren't just ivory towers, are they? The sources talked about them as economic engines.
Exactly. They gave examples like Cornell Tech helping diversify NYC's economy, or Johns Hopkins spinning out companies in Baltimore. And that ability to turn research, like they mentioned a new prostate cancer diagnostic tech into actual products, often depends heavily on that early federal R&D money.
Okay, so that's the funding side. Let's dig deeper into the China student visa issue. The sources really detailed a tightening there.
They absolutely did, describing a much more comprehensive review process now, potential visa revocations for students with any supposed CCP links or those in critical fields.
It builds on older policies, but sounds more intense.
Seems so. They even mention new requirements, like reviewing applicants' social media activity.
And the framing around this policy.
Explicitly America first, according to the sources, which apparently opens the door to denying visas not just on technicalities, but potentially based on perceived anti-American views or support for causes the U.S. opposes.
Was there a specific case mentioned?
Yeah, an anecdote about an AI student from Tsinghua University whose graduation got delayed because of visa problems really brings it home.
And the underlying fear from the U.S. side, as the sources put it.
It's pretty clear. Worries about intellectual property theft and concerns that students might be helping China's military or tech development.
So what about the huge number of Chinese students already here? Something like 270,000. Are they likely to be kicked out?
The sources suggested mass expulsion is unlikely. The focus seems more on preventing new students from coming in, especially in sensitive fields.
Okay, that's a key distinction. So for current students,
The advice seemed to be, unless you're in a really high-tech, sensitive area, you probably don't need to worry excessively while you're in the U.S.
But there's always a but.
The risk goes up significantly if they go home for a visit and then try to come back. Re-entry could be much harder.
And this all fits into that bigger picture of U.S.-China decoupling.
Definitely. The sources framed it as a deliberate strategy. Stop training top talent for a country viewed as an adversary.
And the ripple effects could go beyond just the U.S. and China.
Yeah, the sources floated the idea that other countries might start doing similar things, maybe to protect their own U.S. ties, or just to close off routes for tech and talent transfer they're worried about.
Okay, it's really crucial we look at China's perspective here as the sources laid it out. They used a pretty striking term.
A golden goose, yeah. That's how the sources describe China viewing its students in the U.S.
Because they're the largest international group by far.
By far. And the money is significant, nearly $15 billion in tuition alone in 2019, apparently. Universities like Harvard, Columbia, UCLA were mentioned as being pretty reliant on that revenue.
And what about the families, the parents?
Their perspective, captured in the sources, is basically confusion and frustration. You know, our kids just want to study. Why are they being denied?
So China's official line leverages that.
Seems like it. The narrative hinted at is that these U.S. decoupling moves actually hurt the U.S. too. Because of this financial interdependence, they want to highlight that cost.
But the U.S. response, as described, seems to put security way ahead of those economic arguments.
Absolutely. National security concerns are framed as paramount. The view presented is that students, especially in fields like AI, quantum computing, aerospace, are potential risks.
Risks of what, specifically?
Potential tech spies, basically, or people who could be pressured or co-opted to help the PLA, China's military advance technologically.
And the sources mentioned the CCP's role in this framing.
Yeah, characterizing the CCP system as one of total societal surveillance, which, in this view, makes the national security risk too high to ignore, even for the sake of university finances or academic exchange.
Okay, wow. Let's quickly cover some of the other regional economic bits that popped up. Japan.
Yeah, brief mentions. Increased investment activity there, helped by the Tokyo Stock Exchange's Value Up program, trying to boost company valuations. Also stable unemployment, inflation a bit above target, which might support the Bank of Japan's current policies, and some progress noted in trade talks with the U.S.
And South Korea. Similar story with the Value Up program.
Yes, attracting retail investors there, too. The Kospi Index was reported to be doing well, near bull market levels, apparently on hopes tied to that policy and corporate governance reforms after their election.
Okay. And finally, just a couple of other geopolitical snapshots from the sources.
Right. There was Israel plans mentioned for 22 new settlements in the West Bank, flagged as a potential hurdle for a Palestinian state. And also Israel accepting the U.S. ceasefire plan for Gaza, though Hamas hadn't responded yet, according to these sources.
Anything else?
Just a very brief note on U.S. immigration considering a plan to potentially send some migrants to Rwanda.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, weaving through quite a complex set of issues based on these sources.
We really have. From the nitty-gritty of tariff legal challenges and the clear policy direction there, through the really deep and widening U.S.-China tensions impacting security, tech, trade, and even, as we saw, education and talent flow.
And touching on those related economic moves in Asia and other geopolitical points.
What really stands out, I think, is just how interconnected everything is. A policy change here, a diplomatic move there, it ripples out.
Absolutely. Decisions on tariffs or national security have these very real, tangible effects on university campuses, on tech companies, on international relations. It's not abstract.
Definitely not. And thinking about that tension we discussed, the one the sources highlighted, between U.S. national security worries about Chinese students and the undeniable huge financial contribution those same students make to U.S. universities.
Right, that core conflict.
It really leaves you with a question to chew on, doesn't it? How might that tension security versus economics versus soft power, how might that ultimately reshape international education, not just for the U.S. and China, but maybe, globally? If other countries start following suit with similar policies, what does that future look like?